gonna be. Give it up's gonna be alright.
Hi there, and welcome to this week's episode of Trans Stupid, where I discuss the latest news from the LGBTQIA+++ community, because stupidity is intersectional. Now, the first story I want to touch on today is one which broke not long after I uploaded my last video, so forgive me if it's a little bit out of date, but it's one that I wanted to comment on anyway. Devout Catholic who used wrong pronoun to describe transgender girl to be interviewed by police. When Caroline Farrow, a Catholic commentator and transgender rights campaigner Susie Green, agreed to take part in a television debate about controversial Girl Guides policy, producers would have expected differences of opinion. But while the conversation on screen was certainly heated, it was what happened off-air when the pair continued the debate on Twitter that resulted in a 6-month-long police investigation. Mrs. Farrow, a mother of 5 with strong religious views, allegedly used the wrong pronoun when referring to Miss Green's transgender daughter. Miss Green was so angered by what she described as a distressing and spiteful attack that she lodged a formal complaint with Surrey police, and on the Monday night they contacted Mrs. Farrow and asked her to attend a voluntary police interview. Mrs. Farrow broke the news in a tweet last week where she said, "Had a message from Guildford Police tonight about my tweets following an appearance on GMB with Susie Green and Piers Morgan. Susie Green has reported me for misgendering her daughter." She goes on to say, "I have pointed out to the police that I am a Catholic journalist/commentator, and it is my religious belief that a person cannot change sex, and that we are in the middle of a national conversation about what it means to be male and what it means to be female. Nevertheless, following my appearance on national television, the CPS has decided I need to be interviewed under caution for misgendering Susie Green's child. I don't even remember said tweets. This was in September. I have done nothing wrong, nothing illegal, and will happily do jail time for my right to say that people cannot change sex." She further adds that since the row had blown up on Twitter, she and her family have been subjected to abuse and threats by internet trolls, and that one person had even published photographs that identified her children, as well as bombarding her with sexually humiliating insults. So at this point, I might start sounding a bit like a broken record. I've commented on this dozens of times on my channel. Misgendering someone should not be a crime. The fact that I disagree with misgendering people shouldn't come into it. It's simply a point of free speech. And as much as misgendering might hurt trans people, maybe even including myself, that doesn't mean that the police should get involved. Now, at this point, I think it's fair to give Mermaids a say in this as well, because they've come out and said that the story is actually completely different. On their website, they highlight some of the tweets which Caroline Farrow had sent, which is what they complained to the police about. In their statement, however, Mermaids go on to say it wasn't the misgendering that they called the police on, it was the language which Farrow used, using phrases such as castration, mutilation. Now, I can understand why such comments would be hurtful, and especially hurtful for Susie Green to hear. What Farrow is talking about is Jackie Green, who at the age of 16 became one of the youngest people to undergo gender reassignment surgery. Jackie was taken to Thailand to get the surgery done because you can't have it done over here until you are at least 18 years old. Whilst I can completely understand that these comments were upsetting, I don't think it makes Mermaids look any better than if it was just for simple misgendering. I think that these aren't helpful phrases to use in this debate because they do have an added shock to it that really doesn't represent the experiences of myself or other transsexual people who have this work carried out. We do not see this as a mutilation. This is a way of making ourselves more relatable to our own bodies. And these, unfortunately, the rhetoric of mutilation and castration is quite common within the gender critical movement. But should this mean that people can't say it? And if you've ever been watching any of my videos, you should know what my answer to this is going to be. Absolutely not. Farrow is perfectly entitled to hold these views. She's not the only person to hold them. What Susie Green appears to be doing is just using the police to be able to dictate what can and cannot be considered mutilation or castration. Although technically, the surgery does involve castration. As charged as that part of the statement is, is also factually correct. I don't want to repeat myself too much about the misgendering aspect of this. I've mentioned it in dozens of videos. Such a thing shouldn't be considered a criminal offence. But neither should be making crass remarks about what trans people go through. Whether we like it or not, there are people who are going to be holding these views. Simply silencing them is not going to change that. And everyone's a fan of censorship until it turns around and bites them. We're seeing trans activists run to the police more and more about mean things being said, especially online. But how long is it going to be until you have some of the more radical people in the gender critical movement resorting to the same tactics? I bet the trans activists aren't going to be a fan of censorship when they're on the receiving end. But it almost feels like that's what the inevitable outcome of this is going to be. And if that's the case, the debate's only going to get more and more toxic as we become less and less able to articulate what our positions are when both sides are being considered offensive and worthy of being called to the police. Trans activists need to accept that there are going to be views out there that they disagree with, because they're not going to like it when the shoe's on the other foot. So I might as well just stick with Susie Green for my next story, because surprise, surprise, it involves her as well. 7 police officers sent to remove 4 women from inclusive talk on transgender issues featuring CEO of Mermaids. An academic was forcibly removed by police from a transgender visibility event after organisers complained she made members of a panel discussion feel uncomfortable. Dr. Julia Long was carried out of the Accenture International Transgender Day of Visibility panel event on Thursday night after 7 officers from City of London Police responded to a complaint from organisers about a presence of a group of 4 women. The women were asked to leave after being told they were not welcome at the inclusive event at consultancy firm Accenture's head office in London. Tickets to the event were freely available to the public, with organisers Helena Pradip and Oliver Holmes of the Pride and Accenture Diversity Network sending a message to ticket holders which said, "Please be reminded that this event is centred around inclusion, open to everyone of all ages." At the event, however, Miss Pradip told the women, "My panel does not feel comfortable with you here." The officers who attended said they were there to prevent a breach of the peace, and they believed this is what the group of women were going to do. When they referred to them as guys, Dr. Long was offended, saying, "Did you know that's a hate crime to misgender someone?" She said, "Almost every meeting women have tried to hold over the past year to discuss the impact of their rights or transgender demands has been met with protest and disturbance, with police offering little or no assistance to ensure women's safety. And yet, within half an hour of receiving a complaint about a trans event, 7 police officers were dispatched because the presence of 4 women was considered a threat." So my thoughts on this story are actually a little bit mixed, and this is kind of why I wanted to bring this up. Dr. Long does have a point about trans activists shutting down women's events. In fact, we've seen plenty of examples of this over the last year, and these are not isolated cases either. It's happening all the time. But Dr. Long does also have a track record of disrupting events herself. And back in January, Dr. Long was among a group of people who interrupted a trans event in Washington in the United States. Furthermore, I understand that she didn't actually use her real name when applying for the event. But none of this means that she was there to disrupt. She could have literally been there to ask questions, or not to ask any questions at all and just to see what they were saying. Unfortunately, we will never know because the event's organisers completely jumped the gun. Dr. Long and the rest of the group hadn't done anything. They were just sitting there. This makes the event organisers look as though they don't want to be having any kind of discussion with people who might disagree with them, opting to remove them from the space as opposed to actually having a debate, having a conversation on a difficult subject. Ultimately, this is quite a good PR victory for the gender critical feminists themselves. They can now point to the complete overreaction of the police in this instance when compared to events that they are holding where the police presence is almost minimal and there's very little involvement. And whilst I can't exactly hold the event responsible for the amount of officers who turned up, it's not the best imagery. But it would have been more interesting if we'd actually seen what the group of women were there to do. Unfortunately, we're never going to know the answer to this. And what's more, the event itself was organised as an all-inclusive event, open to everyone. So being open to everyone should mean open to everyone, including and maybe even especially people who hold different views. How are you going to convince these people that you have it right if you're not even going to let them listen? In future, the organisers should allow these groups to sit in and listen. If they become disruptive, then yes, absolutely remove them. But up until that happens, they've not done anything wrong. Now, if you want an example of a group shutting down an event, look no further than Open University, who this week had to pull an event on prison reform because of anger from trans activists. According to The Telegraph, over 100 delegates had already bought tickets to the two-day event in May, which was co-organised by the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, but earlier this month, attendees and speakers were notified the conference had been called off. The CCJS, an educational charity, had been accused of transphobia for its stance that transgender female prisoners should be incarcerated separately from female prisoners. The Open University faced quite significant pressure from transgender activists. They received a number of emails where some of the language was extraordinarily overheated. They were effectively being threatened with demonstrations and disruptive activity, possibly in the conference hall itself, and some kind of picket line or protest outside the conference. The CCJS's position on trans activists was released last month when they said, given the current state of the prison system, in the case of trans women prisoners, we consider that this be best achieved through the provision of accommodation that is separate from female prisoners. This was issued following the case of Karen White, a convicted rapist and paedophile who was born a man but used a transgender persona to attack female prisoners in a women's prison. So it's actually quite interesting to see trans activists shutting down an event on prison reform. Bizarrely, the NUS LGBT and trans campaigns both make prison abolition quite a big part of what they do. But none of that is good enough, because having the opinion that maybe trans women and biological women should be kept separate following what happened with Karen White, that's not good enough anymore. But this is yet another example of trans activists being bullied. They often accuse the rest of society of being the harassers, that they are the poor little oppressed people who can't do anything. And whilst we don't know the exact nature of some of the messages sent to the organisers, if you've seen the way trans activists act on Twitter or Facebook, let's face it, we kind of have a good idea of what they might have said. But these organisations really should not be bending the knee to this kind of rhetoric. Trans activists aren't alone in demanding people whose views they don't like to be completely shut down. But we will be seeing more of this in the future. So the last story I want to comment on kind of ties in with an idea I've had for a video for quite a while now. Whenever we look at LGBT news, or news sources to be specific, there is a very obvious political leaning in there. And this always seems to ignore that in general, LGBT people can be anywhere in the political spectrum. But there's always a strange assumption that we have to be left-wing progressives. So what happens when a group of centre-right to right-wing LGBT activists want to discuss more conservative issues? Well, they end up getting shut down, and the gay press seems to be on the side of the protesters. What a surprise. New York City LGBTI Centre slammed for hosting Republican event. The Gay Star News wrote, an LGBTI centre in New York City has come under fire for agreeing to host a Republican event. The centre agreed to host an LGBT town hall hosted by right-wing campaign group Walk Away. The movement hopes to get LGBTI people to leave the Democratic Party for the Republicans. The panel includes #WalkAway founder Brandon Straka, political commentator Rob Smith, writer Mike Harlow, and conservative trans YouTuber Blair White. White has videos on subjects like there are only two genders, fat acceptance is stupid, and called non-binary identities largely bullshit. But they are. Gay Star News went on to say there was widespread criticism, and that the centre responded to the criticism on their own Twitter, saying all groups utilising the space at the centre must execute a space use agreement and agree to our space use terms and conditions, code of conduct and pledge of non-discrimination. We acknowledge the diversity of our community's perspectives, and while we may be disgusted by or reject the ideas of some groups, we will not stand in the way of their right to say them. GSN's piece goes into more criticism against Walkaway, mentioning a CNN article back in 2018 calling them pure propaganda and linking the hashtag Walkaway with Russian bots attempting to influence the election. Well, as we all know, there's no way that LGBTI people could be voting Republican, and after all, it was the Russians who won the election in 2016, wasn't it? Oh. Okay. The centre was targeted by more journalists saying, "You should be embarrassed by the response. The group is going to walk in and spew out to a bunch of people how they shouldn't be upset if other people deny them services or rights based on their beliefs. Yet you didn't hold your own enough. To them, they shouldn't be either." Also, not hosting this group, which operates in bad faith, intentionally spreads lies and denies the existence of non-binary or gender-fluid folks, is not standing in their way. They can spew their hate literally so many places that aren't safe spaces for LGBTQ people. Again, they always rest on this whole idea of denying non-binary identities. But if you're going to take that approach, I guess I'm going to have to play this clip again. Gaystar News is clearly reporting on the matter with quite a bias. I previously wrote for Gaystar News, and at the time I was told to always approach things in a fair and even manner, and by the tone of their article, it's clearly not what they've done. And unsurprisingly, GSN wasn't the only gay publication to take this approach, as Out magazine were also highly critical of the event themselves. But if there's one thing LGBTQ activists are good at, it's getting things shut down. And naturally, you know where this is going to go. New York LGBT Center cancels right-wing event after backlash. The centre announced they cancelled the March 28th #Walkaway event in a statement issued Friday afternoon. They said it strongly opposes censorship, of course you do, but that it does have the right to cancel any event that promotes discriminatory speech or bigotry. They said the decision to cancel the event came after they were made aware of comments the panellists have made in the past that violates the centre's mission. Permitting this event to proceed would make many of our community members feel unsafe. Well, they always feel unsafe, every single day. The whole world is scary to these people. These are some of the most sensitive people out there, and quite frankly, I don't care if they feel unsafe. None of the people on stage were going to be issuing death threats against activists, but they always make it out as though that's going to happen. But I digress. And, among other things, interfere with their ability to participate in other centre programming. How? You've got the whole, everything there is catered for you. Just because you have one thing you disagree with politically, that means you're going to be physically unable to participate in anything else the centre offers. Seriously? Are you that fragile? Yes, of course they are. What am I saying? Let me continue without any more outbursts. We understand that the work to heal and rebuild trust begins today. See, the problem is you bent the knee. You never bend the knee to these people because no matter what apology you come out with, it will never be enough. The centre's decision comes one day after activists and organisers sent a petition to the centre's executive director demanding the event be cancelled, as well as transparency about how the event was approved in the first place. The statement did not specifically refer to the petition's subsequent demands after asking for cancellation of the event. The petition also included detailed documentation of each of the panel's past comments, including Brandon Starker saying that non-binary identities aren't real. Again, they are not. And transphobic comments made from Rob Smith, Blair White, and Mike Harlow's social media accounts. LGBT organisations and groups really do not like the idea that there might be LGBT people who are capable of politically thinking for themselves. And yes, this does mean moving away from the left. This is something which I'm getting absolutely sick of seeing. This assumption that because we are LGBT, we must therefore kowtow to whatever the left wants us to. Being gay, being lesbian, being bisexual, being transsexual, that has no impact on what your own internal politics are. So yeah, some of the comments made by the panellists in the past are going to be quite provocative, But that's part of who they are. And as I mentioned with Caroline Farrow earlier, whether you agree with their comments or not, should not stop them from making said comments. But there does seem to be a real concerted effort from the LGBT press to get this event shut down. Every one of them who reported on this did it in such a way that they were only criticising Walk Away, and they were clearly in support of having that event shut down. They look at the way Gay Star News ran with it, first of all by saying Blair White is saying non-binary identities aren't valid. But if you look at GSN's comments on Facebook, you will often see gay readers expressing those views. And yes, it's completely fine to say that someone who identifies as water or every single gender in the world out there, but at the same time no gender, is dumb. That's fine. The organisers have said that they were not directly contacted about the cancellation. So that's a bit suspicious, really, isn't it? I want to see groups like Walk Away have more success. The narrative from the LGBT community and the LGBT press is that we are all of one hive mind and that we all have the same political beliefs. And something like Walk Away is a good way of shaking this up. Quite frankly, I would love it if they had a UK equivalent, and I would certainly join up myself. But just as a reminder to everyone, being LGBT should not dictate your politics. A lot of us lean to the right as well. In fact, probably more than you would realise, because coming out as being right-wing in the LGBT community is just as scary as coming out to the rest of society as LGBT. There's such a left-wing presence that it can be alienating if you are actually to put your hand up and say, maybe I'm a little bit conservative, maybe I'm a bit libertarian. Now, it does sound like the event has been able to find another venue, but unsurprisingly, they're keeping it quiet. That venue will be targeted like the centre was. So what are your thoughts on the stories I've covered this week? Is there anything in particular I've missed out? There's a whole load of stupid out there, and whilst there were some stories I did want to cover, I couldn't really fit them in, and some of them were a little bit too bizarre even for trans stupid. But please let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoy my videos, please consider supporting me on Subscribestar or Patreon, the details of which are down below, and make sure to follow me on Twitter as well. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. And a special thank you to Sarah and the rest of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar.